It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Welcome, everybody. This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. It is October of 22. Hopefully, you're having a fantastic day and week and month and year. We just spent several weeks in Florida getting more things ready in the new house and looking forward to things calming down because, quite honestly, at this point, my crocodile tears, is that how that works? The world's smallest violins are going to play that I have extra stress and hassle because I own two houses. But there's a lot to do and a lot to set up and a lot of things to learn. For example, I learned what it's like to be in not a hurricane, but a tropical storm, because that came through the Orlando area. Of course, I'm north of Orlando and the hurricane tropical storm went south of Orlando. A very big difference. Just 40 or 50 miles makes a huge difference. And unfortunately, people down by Fort Myers, southwest Florida, got hit really bad. And so I wish them the best, and hopefully everyone down there is safe. I did hear one newscaster say that this might be the first hurricane ever that hit the west and the east coast of Florida at the same time. And the arms on this, especially towards the Atlantic Ocean, were hundreds of miles long. So even before it made official landfall of the eye in southwest Florida, it was already causing flooding over on the Miami southeastern side of Florida. And the storm surge from the Gulf was horrifically high. I don't know what the official numbers, but 10, 12, 15 feet in some places, where water like that, moving water, your house just doesn't have a chance. It blows houses away. Thankfully, we're in the middle of the state and middle central upper part of the state. And like I said, the storm went south of us. So we had sustained winds, probably 40 to 50 miles per hour and gusts 60s and 70s. Whereas the sustained winds along the southwest part of Florida were really close to 150, 155. Makes a very big difference. And of course, like I said, the storm surge if you are close to the water. We are doing well. Thank you for thinking about us. The biggest problem we had is a tree, 5 or 6, 8-year-old tree fell over. And I'm okay with that because I actually didn't like that tree so much. Gives me some space to maybe put in a palm tree or two, because our yard doesn't have any palm trees. I mean, I'm in Central Florida. I need a palm tree. So maybe we'll replace that with a palm tree there. The nice thing about our house, of course, I'm 120 feet above sea level, and the back end of my yard is 4 to 6 feet below the slab that the house sits on. And then there's a wall where the ground drops away maybe 8 to 10 feet, and then it keeps going down. So about 100 feet behind us, the ground is good 30 feet lower. And so if that fills up and gets to the level of my house and floods my house, we have really big fucking problems. I mean, I might have to build a boat and set sail in that like Noah. No, not really. But anyway, so we did very well, and thoughts and maybe donations to people that are in need. Anyway, enough about that. Later in the show, we are going to talk to Andrew Seidel and his brand new book about white evangelicalism in America and how it is corrupting and destroying the country. I think you're going to want to hear that. And of course, right before that and right after this intro segment, we're going to talk about TIPS again. TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, and why they might be okay as part of your portfolio, but why they might not be okay as part of your portfolio. Another thing that's in the news today, Social Security apparently, or the IRS, well, it'd have to be Social Security, announced there's going to be an 8.7% cost of living increase. So if you're getting Social Security, you just got a big bump in your pay to adjust for the cost of living being higher from inflation. And I often see in conservative websites or people who are conservatives sharing things, and maybe I need to do a segment on this, where they talk about the problem with giving people pay raises and the problem with increasing payments to Social Security is that it causes inflation. So with Social Security, maybe you have an argument there because that's the 100% source of their income and it's just money out of the government being pushed into the marketplace. But with wages, it is not true. Not even close to true. I'm not going to do the math now for it, but one of the ideas to keep in mind is you must consider what part of the overall expenses does a business have that are related to wages. Different industries have different amounts, but I happen to know about fast food from years ago working and doing some research into it. Fast food restaurants, the labor costs, not including owner profit, but management and all the employees, all of those labor costs, actual hourly wages or salaries, is about 20, maybe 25% of the expense. Other things on top of that, workman's comp, Social Security payments, taxes, wages, the building, rent, repairs, maintenance, utility costs, food costs, product costs. And of course, if all of those things go up 10%, well, they're probably going to have to raise their prices 10% because that's just how a business works. But my point is that labor is likely less than 1/4 of the overall expenses for something like a fast food restaurant to run. So if you gave everyone a 10% pay increase, that would increase the costs 10% of the 25%, 2.5%, which means your $10 meal, let's see, 10% would be $1, 1% would be 10 cents. So your $10 value meal would go to $10.25. So a 2.5% increase in the retail price of whatever it is you're buying in that situation would be sufficient to give the employees a 10% raise. So when people talk about food or fast food or some other businesses, if we give people a 10% raise, then you're going to have to raise the prices 10%, and then you're going to want another 10% raise, and then you're going to have more 10% inflation. They are ill-informed, and potentially willfully ignorant, and even some of them, the new category that I created is belligerently ignorant, because there's ignorant, and I'm ignorant about all kinds of things. I just don't know. Then there's intentionally ignorant, where you really don't want to know, but there's belligerently ignorant, where you don't want to know and you also want to make sure other people don't know. So anyway, if wages go up 10%, your fast food meal is not going to go up 10% because of that. If everything that they spend money on is up 10%, maybe they have to raise the costs by 10%. But labor is not a one-for-one increase in the cost of things at retail, which is why when people argue against higher minimum wages, they often miss the mark with that piece of information. Anyway, I wasn't planning on doing that, but that's in the news. The stock market is quite volatile in the last few months. And let's see, depending on what data you're looking at and what day you look, the S&P 500 is down, 20, 25%. So that's kind of annoying. If you are in or close to retirement and had a generous portion, 20, 30, 40%, 50%, if you want to be real conservative, in the cushion, your losses would be less. And of course, if you were fortunate enough to have an overweighting in value stocks versus growth stocks, you've also done considerably better. Let me just give you as an example, Vanguard Large Cap Growth Fund, VIGAX, year to date. And, if you check this on a different day, it can be off by several percentage points because the market fluctuates that much. But I'm looking at it today, minus 34.1% year to date for 2022. Again, middle of October. The value fund, VVIAX, while still down, is down 13.66%. So one fund is down 35, one is down 14. That's a big, very big disparity. And if you have been overly weighted in value, which is the current recommendation of the Polaris plan, which we did 6 episodes of that recently in the summer, you didn't lose as much. Now, you still lost money because almost everything is down. I mean, I'm even going to talk about tips in the next segment, but Treasury inflation protected securities are down. Really safe, air quotes, safe, really boring bonds. And again, thankfully for people in retirement, for the most part, I had been using very conservative bonds. They're down 7 to 8%. That's a buzzkill. That is absolutely unfathomable. I would have never predicted this, 12 months ago. And over the last year, the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index is down almost 15%. So if your bonds are down 7, 8, 9, 12, 13%, you're not down 15. And why is that total bond fund down 15? Because the total bond fund uses short-term bonds like I do, but they also use intermediate length and long-term bonds that I do not use. And one of the long-term bond funds here that I'm looking at from Vanguard, VLTCX, it's down 29%. So if you had bonds hoping for 3 or 4% interest in some long-term bonds, and then you find out you just lost 30% in something that you didn't understand, again, that's a big shock to the system. And there's going to be a lot of people very upset when they're opening their end of September statements. But maybe if you were lucky, if you had really conservative bonds, really safe and boring bonds, an overweighting in value and some exposure to international, maybe you're down 15, 13, 18% year to date. Something like that is definitely possible. If all of your mutual funds, stock-driven mutual funds, were all investing in large cap growth, I have heard the story multiple times from people that are down 25, 30, 35% or more because they did not have a broadly diversified portfolio. Perhaps they made a teeny bit more when things were going well, but now they've lost a whole bunch more when things aren't doing well. And so that's an argument for the diversification. And again, if you had some portfolio like the Polaris plan over the last 10 years, it's made 6%, including this big drop, 6% per year. So it's not been horrible, but short term, it's pretty bad. One other thing that you could think about, and this is, again, as I have the little disclaimers in the show, this is not personalized investment advice. This is probably not right for you, and you probably shouldn't listen to what I'm about to say. So you've been warned. Just keep in mind, if you were willing to add money to the stock market at the end of 21, after it went up 28% in 12 months, if you were willing to add money then, when the market's 23, 22, 25% below where it was 10 months ago, why do you not want to add money now? It's cheaper. It's scary, but it's cheaper. The stock market messes with your head because if you went into a department store to buy a sweater and it was a really nice sweater and it was $100 and you said, I'm going to think about it, and you come back a year later and now it's $200. You didn't want to spend $100, but now, of course, you want to spend $200 and you immediately buy it. Of course not. That's just not how we think about it when we're buying things. When you're buying stocks, at least at some kind of fundamental level, if you were doing evaluations of what the companies are worth, they may have decreased in value in what they're worth and the amount of revenue they can produce in the short term. But in the long term, most companies are just as viable today as they were a year ago. But now maybe the valuations are more realistic. But I don't know. Maybe 20% lower is realistic. Maybe we go back to where it was 10 months ago. And keep in mind, if the market goes down 25%, so let's say you have $100,000 invested and it's now $75,000. If it simply returns to where it was and the 75 becomes 100 again, you have made 33%. So the gains can be bigger when you buy at lower prices. So it's something to contemplate if you have a little extra cash lying around in your local bank that you do not need. You must always have some money to cover your bills and expenses. But if you have 200,000 that you're like, no, I don't know. And again, I don't know if the market's going to be even lower in the next few months. I don't know that it's not going to fall 20% over the next few months. But I do know from a historical perspective, when markets do eventually recover, and we may not be at the bottom, I'm not claiming to have that knowledge, but you can buy today 20% discount from what you were happy to buy 10 months ago. I don't know. It's just something to think about. If you are in a situation where you have the cash flow and cash on hand, you could consider adding the money that you're scared to add. And it might be a good idea for somebody, maybe one listener out of the tens of thousands that hear the show. Now, the other thing that's a possibility, if your job is safe and secure and you had a broadly diversified portfolio with 20 or 30% of your money in bonds, and you think, well, my job's still great. I love my job. If something happens to this job, I have a partner that has a job, or you have a very valuable skill that you could get at another job easily, you could consider reducing the part that's in the cushion and moving some of that money into stock index funds. This is a high risk idea. It is not correct for the vast majority of people that are listening. I gave the warning up front. I want to reiterate it now. For most people, you should have a plan. You should add money on a regular basis, monthly, quarterly, annually, whenever you do it, and just keep doing that going forward. Your plan doesn't have to be the Polaris plan. Something like it would make me happy, but your plan can be whatever it is, and you want to follow that plan. However, when the market is down 20%, if you are safe and secure and have some extra income or money or security, it might be a time to consider doing something wacky. And like I said, this is probably not right for you. Assume that this is not right for you. I am talking to a small percentage of people that might be listening. If you want to run through this or think it over, you can email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. If you are a current client, you of course get priority. I've already talked to a few people that have this correct situation where it works for them, and we moved some of the cushion money into stocks, but it's a risky move. It's a high risk move that might pay off very well in the next 3 to 5 years, but it might not. So just think about yourself. And I mean, if you're already freaking out because the market's down 20% or your portfolio is down 30% or more because you're all in the wrong stuff, well, maybe you'd be better off just fixing your fucking portfolio. That would be the thing. Maybe your plan is not the best plan. See how you can figure that out and fix that. Anyway, I'm just carrying on now. So we're going to go into a break. We're going to learn more about tips, an update on tips. We're going to talk to Andrew Seidel about his brand new book. We're going to do all that, and then maybe some thoughts at the end. Quick reminder, of course, Polaris Financial Planning, my business. And one of the reasons I do this, I like doing the podcast because it's informative and educational. My intent is to help people Of course, I do get a few listeners that from time to time decide to hire me. My current minimum for assets under management, if you wish to hire Phil, if you wish to utilize Polaris Financial Planning, is temporarily reduced from 5 million to 2 million. And I know that's not the vast majority of listeners. I get it. I'm sorry. I wish you had more money. I really do wish you had more money. I wish you had a lot more money and that you hired me. That would be great. But for some listeners, if you're 2 million or above and you thought, gosh, I missed the opportunity because now it's 5 million, it's now currently back to 2 million. So if that fits you, again, email me, Phil at Polaris Financial Planning. Hang on for a little interesting interlude here, and we'll get on with the rest of the show.
The nun gets up in the morning and leaves and walks down the corridor. And another nun looks at her and says, it's a difficult thing to say, another nun, and says, you got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. And she goes on down, and another nun says, you got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning. And this happens 15 times, and by then she's livid. And she meets the Mother Superior. And the Mother Superior is just about to open her mouth, and the sister says, don't tell me that I got out of the wrong side of the bed this morning! And the Mother Superior said, I wasn't going to say that. I was just going to say, what are you doing with the bishop's shoes on?
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. This Investing Skeptically segment is a brief follow-up on TIPS, T-I-P-S, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities from the U.S. government that you can buy direct, but they're also tradable. I'm not going to go through all the details of how they work because I have talked about them 3 times prior in the last year and a half. And if you want to know a whole bunch more about tips, of course, you can go to something like Investopedia or some older episodes of this show. Tips were discussed briefly in 383. That was also the episode with Aaron Ra. And let's see here, 396, which was October of last year, where I specifically gave warnings, expressed serious concern about the possible downside to tips, which we're going to talk about more. And in episode 409 from January of 22, and we're now in the fall of 22. So I wanted to give you a brief update, I guess. And one of the things that is a problem with tips, because they are tradable, you can buy them and sell them for more than what they're worth. What their face value is, I guess I should say. And that's a pretty cool thing. And like I said, I'm not going to go into all the details of that because I've done that before. But in short, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities provide a certain flexibility and adjustability. Yeah, the government will pay more interest if inflation is high and less interest if inflation is low. And if you perceive that inflation is going to be high for a long period of time, the face value, say, for example, you start with a $1,000 bond, the face value can go up to $1,050, $1,100, $1,200, and you can make higher dividend payments or you can make more money when you sell the bond because the face value goes up. If you hold it to maturity, you're going to get the stated interest plus some protection against rising rates. But if inflation goes down, you could have a problem. You could essentially make nothing. I mean, it's a hedge against inflation, but how much are you paying extra to get that hedge? And so about a year ago, I was discussing these, and I specifically warned people to be very careful with these because if you're buying them direct, some of your downside and upside potential is limited. But if you get them in an ETF or in a mutual fund, you could be less than satisfied with the results. So I'm taking a moment to look at two different investment possibilities where you could have used TIPS. Now, the first one is iShares TIPS Bond ETF. The symbol is TIP. And I tell you this because you could go look for yourself to see what has happened. And year to date, in calendar year 2022, we're in middle of October. Year to date, this ETF is down 13%. So you might have thought that you were protecting yourself against inflation, and maybe you kind of were, but other people were concerned about inflation and very concerned about inflation. So people were paying more for the bonds than what their face value was. And now, a year later, the popular opinion, the average investor thinks that at some point inflation is going to go down. And of course, you have some famous people throwing around deflation. Of course, if you have a bond that goes up in value when there's inflation, it also is set up to go down in value with deflation. So you can lose a lot of money. So now that it looks like inflation is either not going to go up anymore or might go down a little bit, which has been the effect so far, but the Fed has made it perfectly clear that their number one priority at this time is to raise interest rates, or what is called taking away the punch bowl, because the party has gotten too aggressive, too excited, and they are going to do whatever it takes, whatever is within their power, to nip inflation in the bud. It doesn't even have to succeed. I mean, it doesn't have to succeed yet for people to think that it's going to succeed. And so when people think that inflation is going to go back down to 2 or 3% from the 7, 8%, 9% that it was for a few months, TIPS become far less valuable because the interest payments you're going to get going forward are zero, next to nothing, or maybe even negative. And so the TIPS that you own, if you hold them to maturity, fine, you get your money back, plus whatever minuscule inflation that you were going to get. But if you want to sell them, who wants to buy them from you? Who wants to pay you a premium to lose money? That's why they're down 13%. The other thing I'm looking at just for comparison is a Vanguard mutual fund. Let's see, I think this is technically an index fund. The expense ratio is 0.1, so I'm going to just say that it is. The performance numbers, this fund symbol VAIPX, and year to date, this fund is down 12.9%. The ETF was down 13.2. This is down 12.9. If you have a really poorly run ETF or mutual fund with really high expense ratios, you'll probably have results worse than this. So this is what has happened so far year to date in calendar year 2022, something that maybe you thought was kind of like a magical trick where you could protect your money and then even protect against inflation. And if you thought that but didn't understand the underlying principles of how these things work, when you open your statement and see that you've lost 13% in something that you thought you couldn't really lose money in, well, that's going to be a bit of a shock for some people. So this is one of those things where really knowing what you're doing helps out quite a bit, because you can avoid these things. Because at the time they are the most popular, when the prices are going up and people seem to be making good amounts of money, because in 2020, these things, according to this Vanguard mutual fund index fund, they made 11%. 21, they made 6%. Well, year to date, they're down 13%. So if you bought them when everyone else was buying them, which is actually kind of likely because that's part of why the price went up, because a lot of people wanted to buy them to protect themselves. It's in the name, inflation protected securities. But the result is that you not only didn't match inflation of 7 or 8 or 9%, but you lost 13%. So that's some thoughts about that. Go listen to the older episodes if you want. And hopefully this is in some way helpful to help you learn more about how different types of investments and markets work.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
And they told me the story all about this guy named Lehi who lived in Jerusalem in 600 BC. Now, apparently, in Jerusalem in 600 BC, everyone was completely bad and evil, every single one of them, man, woman, child, infant, fetus. And God came to Lehi and said to him, "Put your family on a boat and I will lead you out of here." And God did lead them. He led them to America. I said, "America? From Jerusalem to America by boat in 600 BC? And they said, yes. Then they told me how Lehi and his descendants reproduced, and over the course of 600 years, there were two great races of them, the Nephites and the Lamanites. And the Nephites were totally, totally good, each and every one of them, and the Lamanites were totally bad and evil, every single one of them, just bad to the bone. Then, after Jesus died on the cross for our sins, on his way up to heaven, he stopped by America and visited the Nephites. And he told them that if they all remained totally, totally good, each and every one of them, they would win the war against the evil Lamanites. But apparently somebody blew it, because the Lamanites were able to kill all the Nephites, all but one guy, this guy named Mormon, who managed to survive by hiding in the woods. And he made sure this whole story was written down in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics chiseled onto gold plates, which he then buried near Palmyra, New York. Well, I was just on the edge of my seat. I said, "What happened to the Lamanites?" And they said, "Well, they became our Native Americans here in the U.S." And I said, "So you believe the Native Americans are descended from a people who were totally evil?" And they said, "Yes." Then they told me how this guy named Joseph Smith found those buried gold plates right in his backyard. And he also found this magic stone back there that he put into his hat and then buried his face into. And this allowed him to translate the gold plates from the Reformed Egyptian into English. Well, at this point, I just wanted to give these two boys some advice about their pitch. I wanted to say, okay, don't start with this story. I mean, even the Scientologists know to start with a personality test before they start telling people all about Xenu, the evil intergalactic overlord.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Investments should be based on your personal situation, and you, of course, should consult with your financial advisor or tax professional before taking any actions. All right, everybody, I'm just going to jump right into it. Andrew Seidel is here with us today. How are you, sir?
I am well, my friend. It's a pleasure to be joining you again.
You're too kind. We were having too much fun pre-show, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. And sadly, I have things to do other than just laying in my brand new Florida pool. But how are things for you?
Crazy, a new book launch.
Yeah.
So life is a little insane right now.
I actually meant to do this. I got to go to some big internet-based bookseller and see the exact title. But why don't you fill us in? What's it called? What's it about?
The new book is called American Crusade: How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. And the subtitle kind of says it all.
Yeah.
Religious freedom has long been this shield, right?
Yeah.
This protection for us, everybody, all of us, against government overreach. It's the minority's protection from the tyranny of the majority. It's the Jews' protection from the overbearing Christian. Same thing for the atheist and the Hindu and the Muslim. And it's long been this right that we possess equally.
Yeah.
I've I've often hoped that it was embodied in the words that are etched into the edifice of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C.
You are the dreamer.
Equal justice under law. Well, I mean, good, 4 pretty phenomenal words. And it's religious freedom has long been supported by a strong separation of church and state, but not anymore.
Well, and just before we get too much into this book, which we will, your other book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, highly recommended to anybody. You should get both of them, and they're on my favorite format, Audible. Oh, yeah. And like I tell people, I pay people to read books to me. So yeah, that's my bougie thing that I do, because when I sit with a book, I get bored out of my mind. But when I'm listening to it, I can speed it up and do other things. But that talked about the founding and the founding myths, because it's in the title. It's nice. But now we're talking about really kind of stuff that's mostly the last 30 years, but it's really kind of been building for 40, 50, 60 years for different reasons and different motivations. And I run into more and more people who believe in an alternate reality, which is not the one that you and I recognize as factually based reality. Things like this is America, and the Christians are the ones being prosecuted, and how can they protect themselves? Does that seem like that's going on?
No, not in America. But I mean, just before I dive into that, you're absolutely right. I think the books pair nicely together. The Founding Myth really goes over the founding of the country and the values, and debunks, shreds, rips apart the idea that we were founded as a Christian nation, or that any part of our government was based on Judeo-Christian principles. You get a couple chapters in there on the Civil War in the 1950s. And then American Crusade really is how we have gotten so far away from some of those ideals, and the deliberate attempts to take us away from those ideals. And you're right to pin it back. Really, the book talks for the most part about the last maybe decade and a half.
Yeah.
But you're right to date it back. Really, it goes back to Brown versus Board of Education. That's really when we saw the roots of this crusade take hold, or be, I guess that's a little too passive, planted by racists and segregationists.
I was going to throw in those words myself, racist, racism, Christian nationalism. And unfortunately, I mean, it's not unique to the United States of America, but there's an in-group and there's an out-group. And the in-group is white Christians and the out-group is black, whether you're Christian or not. And then if there's not enough blacks around, we'll talk about Hispanics. And if there's not Hispanics around, we'll talk about Asians, or American Indians, which I have some American Indian blood myself. It's a small amount. But why are humans like this? Why can't they just enjoy the benefits of their lives without having to put someone else down or in their place?
I mean, that's a fantastic question.
No answer. But
it goes to one of the questions that I think is really important in the book, in the book itself. Right, American Crusade is about this crusade to weaponize religious freedom. But one of the questions that I struggled with as I was trying to answer this is why? Like, why are they trying to turn this hallowed protection into a weapon to impose their religion on other people, to violate other people's rights? Yeah. And it's a hard question to answer when you're not interested in doing that, like when you think that's wrong. And the answer is that it is largely a backlash against equality realized. So Christianity was once able to discriminate on the basis of race, and now that is largely unthinkable. Christianity was once able to legally subjugate half the population. Christianity was once able to discriminate against LGBTQ people, but now it's not. And as more people realize the rights that are due to them by virtue of being human, that sphere of religious imposition shrinks. And the crusade is an attempt to reclaim that lost ground.
Yeah. And so I think I heard it in your book, this idea of take America back. the question that often pops into my mind, how far back do you want to go? I mean, some will say to the 1950s, and some will say, oh no, I think in 1850s, and then sometimes even further, because it's been thrown out the slippery slope with this Roe versus Wade thing, which happened right after your book got finalized. But they're like, oh well, we'll never actually do that. Whoops, they did that. But they won't come for your ability to have birth control. It's just a sloppy, slippery slope argument, and they're not going to do that. And of course, within days of Roe being overturned, there's politicians out on the state and national level saying, you know what, we want to get rid of all birth control. And so it's not a crazy argument. They just won't stop until we are a theocracy run by white men, and everyone else just stays in your place and stay out of the way, and everything will be fine.
Well, in their minds, yeah. I mean, and so a couple of things on that point. Yeah, the book was finalized. The text was finalized at the beginning of May, and I went back and forth with my publisher about this, and I was like, "Look, there's going to be some big things that happen in June. I kind of think we should wait."
Yeah,
and they really wanted to do it, and they said we're going to do an update as soon as we can. So the book was finalized right before the Roe, or the leaked opinion overturning Roe came out.
Wow.
The news broke, and I was able to sneak that bit in. I knew this was coming anyway. I didn't know the leaked opinion was coming, but I knew that the court was going to overturn Roe. I'd been saying so for years at that point.
Yeah.
So I wasn't surprised there. But for everybody who's wondering, there is an update to the book available for free on my website. There's a link in the text itself, so you can go read the update right now for free on my website, and that is going to be worked into the next printing of the book. So it'll be seamless. I'm not sure what the plan is for the audiobook though. That's a good question.
Well, and it's funny because at the rate this shit is happening every year, you could easily update this book with here's new cases.
And that was where the publisher and I ended up when we were talking about it, because we knew from the beginning of writing it that there was always going to be a need for an update, and the spate, the flow of religious freedom cases going to the court has been increasing and more and more and more every single year, because this court is packed with crusaders that want to take these cases. And let me just say, I want one other thing on the slippery slope point that you were making earlier, because I think that it's a really important question to answer, is essentially like, well, when will they stop?
They're not.
And the answer to that is there will never be enough power and privilege to satisfy the crusaders. Never.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, what we are seeing now is only the beginning. I mean, I long said that the end of Roe was just going to be the beginning. They're going to come for contraception. They're going to come for gay marriage. They're coming for all of our rights. And the question is not when will they stop. The question is when will we stop them?
Yeah, absolutely. And transphobia, gay phobia, they want to push back on all that stuff. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to know you exist. They don't want you to talk about it. If they get that, great. Then they can look at birth control, great. And then they can talk about women working. They can talk about how you have to own property to vote. They can talk about going back to the 3/5 compromise. And then they can go all the way back to 2,000 years ago, or at least what in their mind was the world 2,000 years ago, because often the Bible that they're promoting is not the Bible that actually exists. So, the idea that the Bible is very clear, it's marriage is one man and one woman. If you've read the Bible, it's very clear that that's the one thing that it's not.
I've got a couple sections on that.
Yeah,
but I mean, you're right. And I don't think people realize how close we are to seeing white supremacy revived through religious freedom arguments.
I think what you mean to say, if I can be so bold, how much white supremacy will be legitimized by law, because I think it's already been revived. It's just not technically legitimate yet.
Yes, and quote unquote legalized discrimination. Yes, it's a good caveat. I appreciate it. So I mean, and one of the points that I make is, if you go, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case was the gay wedding.
I was just gonna, talk to me.
And if you listen to the oral argument in that case, it's one of the questions that the justices kept coming back to was, well, look, if we allow you, business, limited liability corporation in Colorado, to discriminate against a gay couple, how can we stop you from discriminating against somebody who's black or an interracial couple? And the answer to that did not exist. They tried to answer it. They fumbled. There is no good answer, because once you allow discrimination in the name of God, once you allow someone's religious freedom claim to violate the rights of others, once you allow religious freedom to harm others, there's no way to draw a line between those different kinds of discrimination, those different kinds of harm. So they basically just kept saying, well, race is different, but nobody made a convincing argument. And then in the wake of that case, you actually see people making the argument that, well, I can discriminate on the basis of race. I have one particularly vile example in the book. But and by the way, that argument that religious freedom is something that allows you an exemption from civil rights laws was tried immediately when the Civil Rights Act was passed.
Right.
And the Supreme Court laughed it off in a footnote. Like that's how bad and dumb and stupid and ridiculous that argument is. And now this court is seriously considering that in multiple cases, and likely this term going to decide a case called 303 Creative versus Elenis, which will almost certainly say that businesses have a free speech right, a different First Amendment right, to exempt themselves from civil rights laws and discriminate against LGBTQ people if they want.
I mean, we're heading this direction, and we can talk about the many cases and arguments that have got us here. But what we're really talking about is that at some point, someone, I'll just pick a name, Microsoft, could declare that it's a Christian company, and whatever type of Christian or subsect that they deem, and they could say, we think people should be responsible for their own medical care, and now they no longer have to provide health care, which actually they probably don't have to provide it now, but everybody does, because you would never get any employees. But they could also say, we don't have to hire this group of people, that group of people. We don't have to hire women. These are our religious convictions, and we are free to do what we want to do. And of course, the counter argument from the other side, or I guess maybe not the other side, another argument from them is that, well, you can just go get a job somewhere else, or you can get a cake somewhere else, or you can get a wedding dress somewhere else. But for a lot of people, and this is one of the reasons we had the civil rights, is there was nowhere else to go. I just recently, I don't know if it got to this in the end of the book, but like sundown laws and how horrific they were, and they weren't that long ago.
No, I mean, within listeners' lifetimes, for sure. And there are, so that argument is certainly addressed a couple of times in the book, including in the various cases. And then the race to the bottom that you're talking about with companies adopting religious tenets to avoid regulation is something that I hypothesized we would start to see in the wake of the Hobby Lobby case. And I have a whole chapter on the Hobby Lobby case in American Crusade as well. And I mean, I do think it's not, I think that has been slowly happening. And I think the more we see this weaponization of religious freedom, the more we're going to see that happening. Because once companies start to do that, they gain a pretty significant competitive edge, right? If you can avoid regulation by adopting, a set of Christian beliefs as a company, that can save you a lot of money on your bottom line. Yeah. And the courts have been beyond lenient. In the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, right? That was a case about Masterpiece Cake Shop Limited Liability Corporation. That is a business, a corporation organized and protected under the laws of the state of Colorado. That business is not the person who owns it, Jack Phillips. In fact, the whole point of setting up the limited liability corporation is to divorce the individual from the corporation, to separate those two legal entities to protect the individual.
Correct.
And yet we have the court allowing that individual to impose their religion on customers through that limited liability corporation, which is the same thing that you saw happen in the Hobby Lobby case, except it was worse there.
Yeah.
Because the Green family, who owns Hobby Lobby, doesn't own the company directly. They own trusts, a series of trusts, and those trusts own the stock in the Hobby Lobby corporation. So you have the Greens' personal religion flowing through legal trusts, through those into the corporate. So you have all these layers of protection that prevent them from being personally liable if their company, say, I don't know, poisons a bunch of kids because they import cheap shit from China and kids put things in their mouth all the time, right? Like the Greens are personally protected if Hobby Lobby screws up that way. So is the bakery. Like if he, bakes a cake that gets 30 people sick at a wedding and they end up in the hospital with food poisoning, Jack Phillips isn't going to pay any damages for that. Masterpiece Cake Shop might. Masterpiece Cake Shop might go bankrupt. But that's the whole reason you set up these companies. And this is just something that's entirely lost when we get into the religious freedom discussions about this.
Absolutely.
And it's ridiculous.
And I want to emphasize the point that, of course, is in the book, and a lot of people will not know this. The bakery that refused to make the wedding cake or any cake to the gay couple, it's kind of a popular idea in the internet that they refused on artistic grounds.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want to put gay stuff on a cake, but it never even got to that. It was basically a gay couple came to the store and they said, "Oh, you're gay. We don't like you. You're icky. We're not going to sell you a cake of any kind. Get the fuck out." Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially correct. And this is one of the things that I think makes American Crusade different than a lot of pop law books, right? I tell you what really happened in each case, because not only did I live many of these cases and follow many of these cases closely and actually fight in these cases, right? This has been my whole career, right?
Yeah, you could almost say you were often in the room where it happened.
Yeah, I mean, really, like I litigated some of these, I briefed others. I have been on the front lines defending our country from this assault. And so I know when the conservative justices on our Supreme Court are bending reality to fit their desired outcome, when they're lying about the facts, when they're ignoring facts and photographic evidence, when they're ignoring lower court judges who are warning them about the deceitful narratives which are spun by opposing counsel. So in the book, I dug much deeper and I tell the true stories of what happened. And then I interviewed the people who were involved in these cases, right? So for the gay wedding cake case, I interviewed Charlie Craig and David Mullins. I spoke with them at length. I got their firsthand account of what happened and what happened in the room where it happened, right? The actual oral argument at the Supreme Court. And then I interviewed members of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, which was handling that case, and which the Supreme Court labeled as these anti-religious bigots to find in favor of the bakery in this case. So basically, if people probably don't remember this, they remember the bakery won, but what the court said was the members of the Colorado Civil Rights Commission were hostile to the bakery's religion. They said mean things about this Christian man or his Christianity, and therefore the entire procedure was tainted, and he can't be held liable for violating the gay couple's civil rights. So they basically gave him a get out of jail free card.
Yeah, and it's one of my greatest fears when religion finally wins the argument, where it can say, you can't even offend me. You can't even have the wrong tone when you're talking about my religion, just like we have in a lot of modern day Muslim countries where you can't speak ill of the prophet. You can't speak bad about the leadership. It's illegal.
And that's essentially what the court held in this case. Like, if you what you said was too mean about the Christian and the Christianity of this baker. And by the way, the people who said these things, so I really untangled. The court manufactured that hostility. It was bullshit. Yeah. It's just not true. One of those civil rights commissioners became interested in civil rights after hearing Martin Luther King speak on civil rights on the National Mall, listening to his dream, right, as a college freshman. She told me her story about getting involved in this. And the other supposedly anti-religious comment was actually quoting a New Mexico Supreme Court judge, right? So there's a commissioner trying to figure out the law and quoting a judge from a neighboring state to try to arrive at the correct decision. And by the way, a decision that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had quoted in earlier cases. So, this is what we want civil servants to be doing when they're trying to reach these conclusions. And instead you have the Supreme Court calling them anti-religious bigots. And it's just appalling.
You also have a story to counter the narrative of where a religion was actually oppressed. With the Santeria.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little bit on that so we know what actual religious oppression looks like? Which is, I think, why you had it in the book, and it was great to have it.
Yeah, it's really, it's important because we have this idea of hostility towards religion. It continually resurfaces at the Supreme Court in these cases. And the court is constantly saying, if you're hostile to religion, we're gonna strike down your action. That's what they did in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. So it's really useful to look at a true example of that hostility. And in the late 80s and into the 90s, there was a case in Hialeah, Florida, where a Santeria church rented space in downtown and wanted to open a physical church building. And this was a religion that had been largely underground. It was largely practiced in homes. And you have the city council and the community just go nuts. And I tell the story about this. This is like a pitchfork and torches kind of meeting, right? Where everybody's out protesting the fact that this church is going to open. And you have city councilors saying things like, what can we do to stop this church from opening? And how can we drive this church out of town? I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotes are in the book. You have the chaplain of the police department. That's a problem in itself. Saying similar things, right?
Right.
And what they effectively do is they pass this series of rules and regulations that prevent the church from opening. And they do this all because the church practices animal sacrifice.
Yeah, because Christianity has nothing to do with animal sacrifice, blood sacrifice, atonement through the death of an animal, sending an animal in the desert to carry off your sins. Christianity never has done any of that, right?
Yeah, and that's not what John 3:16 is talking about or anything like that either. It's it was a really interesting. The story's fascinating. I actually almost put the book aside to write an entire book just about this story, and I had a couple walls in some of the archives down in Hialeah, but I'm still hoping to maybe broaden this into a larger story sometime too, because there's other things that were going on here as well, which I explain in the book. There's some it's basically, this ends up being like, if anybody's read Carl Hyacin, this ends up being like a Carl Hyacin novel. It is one of the most remarkable stories in American law. And it becomes, the town successfully legislates the church out of existence, and the church sues. And the Supreme Court says, this is textbook hostility towards religion. And by the way, this is the first time the court found that, because it's pretty rare to actually see, while there is certainly religious strife in this country because of the separation of church and state, you often don't see that. You rarely ever see that manifesting itself into our laws. That kind of hostility towards one minority, with the possible exception of us atheists. Now, that became literally the textbook case. I've written a textbook called Religion and the Law, and it's like, this is the case where we all point to. It's so very clear. But it lay dormant for basically 25 years until the middle of this crusade, when Sam Alito on the Supreme Court discovers, hey, if we say that people are being hostile to Christians, that changes everything. We've got this really strong precedent, and we can overturn anything we want. And that they take advantage of this case of very clear hostility toward a hated religious minority and turn around and start applying it to mainstream Christianity and saying that anything that sounds mean or critical, or could be read as critical, or could be read as hostile to Christianity, we strike down. And that's what we're seeing in case after case after case now.
Yeah, because I hear this from just average run-of-the-mill Christians about how oppressed they are and how they can't do what they want to do and how the nation is turning against them. And it's like, well, let's look who's been elected. Oh, virtually all Christian. Let's look at who's on the courts. Oh, virtually all Christian. Let's look at the laws. Oh, special perks and privileges for you. It's a fascinating. I am fascinated by the human mind and how it sees something that's not there. Because one of my pet things is how can so many Republican Americans who are, as a large part, are poor, have low income, and are always going to have low income, think that it's a good idea to cut the taxes on the super wealthy. And I think in part in their head, they've bought this idea that in a few years, that's going to also be me.
Yeah, that'll be me. Yeah.
And it's not. It's not going to be you. And your taxes are going up and their taxes are going down. And you seem to be okay with that. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Well, so one of the things that I found really interesting in this book, and to tie it to your persecution point, is that the Crusaders, and I'm including the conservative Christians like the Bakery, like Hobby Lobby, they're cowards, right? They lack the courage of their loudly confessed religious convictions. Right. So American Christians' own religion tells them to expect tribulations, right? The government and the law are not going to bend to your every whim and fancy.
Right.
Like impending persecution is like one of the few points on which all four gospels agree. And, American Christians preach and expect and yearn for that persecution, right? The fabricated war on Christmas, the God's Not Dead movies, the Left Behind books.
Right.
Fox News, is all about feeding this persecution complex. And you're right, because there's a study that I recount the study in the book. About half the country and 3/4 of Republicans think that American Christians face persecution. And according to PRRI, which did the poll, white evangelicals are the only major religious group in which the majority say Christians face a lot of discrimination. And they're also the only group that thinks American Christians face more discrimination than Muslims, which is, it's ridiculous. I would be the first to stand alongside my Christian comrades if the government were persecuting them, but that is just not happening.
Yeah.
What you're seeing is conservative Christians trying to shift the burden of their belief onto other people. Right. So the baker in the Colorado case doesn't believe in gay marriage, but he's trying to shift the burden of bearing that belief onto other folks. Right. If it were just himself, he would not get gay married.
Exactly. And of course, that ties into one of the other things is the licenses for gay marriage. And what is the young lady's name? Kim
Davis. Yeah, Kim Davis.
Kim Davis.
She's a perfect example of this. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think we're going to the same place, but she's talking about how religion is sacred. It's one man and it's one woman. And she's had 3 divorces and 4 marriages, maybe children out of wedlock, and a continuously long list of every Christian thing that is illegal or prohibited. She's done it all, but she's going to draw a line in the sand that marriage is between one man and one woman, the one thing that's not clear in the Bible. And she's just going to, like you said, impose her beliefs on everyone that comes to her. She's using the power of her job, the power of a government position to literally oppress people. And the right wing went nuts about how she's the one being oppressed.
Yep, exactly. And I have a chapter on Kim Davis in American Crusade. And we can do it with Hobby Lobby too, right? They are shifting the cost of their religious belief onto the tens of thousands of employees of their company instead of shouldering that belief, the burden of that belief on their own. So one of the things that was just really striking to me reading this book is that conservative Christians are cowards. And the Crusaders are cowards, and they must find the courage to bear the costs of their beliefs, and especially their bigotry. And because they cannot, because they are cowards, and because they have this need for political power, they're actually feeding their own demographic decline.
Yeah, it's absolutely staggering. I don't want to give away the whole book, but is there anything we should know before we wrap up, or any places you're going to be, aka Florida, to give talks in the near future?
I will be in Florida soon. We're trying to work out the hurricane kind of scotched those plans, but
Yeah.
we're desperately trying to find another date. It's looking like it'll be early December at the moment. I'll be in Colorado in Denver on November 5th. I'm going to be in Houston and Dallas on the 14th and 16th of October. I got a couple of virtual events coming up. I'm all over. I mean, I would really love for people to pick up a copy of the book. We I think scratched the surface, and it really is, to me. You cannot understand what is happening right now in this country and with our Supreme Court without understanding this crusade. You're adrift. No matter how much you think you understand it, no matter how closely you think you paid attention to these cases, you don't even know the half of it. It's so much worse than you realize.
Fair enough. Give me a 1-minute rundown of where you work now and what they do.
I am at a wonderful organization called Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit educational and advocacy org, and we bring together people of all religions and of none to protect the right of everyone to believe as they want, and importantly, to stop anyone from using their beliefs to harm others, which is a big part of what this book is about. And AU fights in the courts and the legislatures and the public square for freedom without favor and equality without exception. It's been doing this work for 75 years, working to ensure that church and state remain separate, and that we have that religious freedom remains that shield for each of us. So I'd really love for people to join AU. It's au.org. You had Rachel Lazar, our CEO and president, on a couple months ago.
Yeah.
She gave a great interview. I encourage people to go listen to that to find out a little bit more too.
Fantastic. Everyone, this is Andrew Seidel, and the newest book is American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. I've got 75% of it done, and I'm going to finish the rest in the next couple of days. Highly recommend it. Also, The Founding Myth, Andrew's previous book. Andrew, thank you so much for being on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Always a pleasure, my friend, truly.
You're listening to the Phil Ferguson Show.
Well, of course, it's time to wrap up the show, and hopefully you learned something about TIPS, Treasury, inflation-protected securities, and maybe you also learned about white supremacists, white Catholic evangelical supremacists, whatever we're going to call them, Christo-fascists, and how they want to take over, and maybe have already taken over our courts, how they have taken over the Republican Party, and we need to be loud and volunteer and vote. Definitely do that. Speaking of terrible things, Donald Trump is still a free man, but the January 6th committee is still doing their investigations and recently put on another show that should have been in prime time, but clearly detailed how much he knew and how much he knew in advance, how it was planned out. It was not an accident. It was not a fluke. It was not something that just happened. It's what he wanted to happen, and he got what he wanted, and it's awful. And we were only a few people away, or a few minutes away, from an actual coup. I don't know that I can be over dramatic about this. The idea that there was a riot is not strong enough. The idea that there was a protest is not strong enough. It was a failed coup attempt of Donald Trump attempting to take over the entire United States. Other fun news: Alex Jones lost in court again to Sandy Hook families. And this time, between all of the families, he is on the hook for almost $1 billion. And that is before they calculate the attorney costs, which he has to pay. So I want him to be broke. I want him to live in poverty. And quite honestly, I think he should spend the rest of his lives in a cell. Maybe he can share it with Donald Trump, because they're both horrible, horrible human beings. Anywho, if you have any questions, you can send me an email, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com. And again, a brief reminder, the minimum for new clients has been temporarily reduced from $5 million of assets to $2 million. The money in your house doesn't count. The money in your 401k or 403b doesn't count because of the Department of Labor rule, which we've talked about. I can't give you any guidance on what you should do with that. You're on your own. But if you are one of those lucky people that have $2 million or more of assets that can be managed, please feel free to email me and we can talk. And if you still think it's a good idea, we can proceed forward with that kind of stuff. I'm just going to wrap up because I have a lot of stuff to still do today, but I do appreciate you listening to the show. And what is it, next week? Oh, I don't have my calendar up. In about a week, I will be flying to Las Vegas for CSI Con, be in Vegas for several days. And then after that, the wife and I, we are going to San Antonio for the FFRF convention. So I do hope to see you out there on the road somewhere soon. If you do see me, come up and say hello. I look forward to seeing you in person. Until then, ciao.